Tim Walker adjusted his hat under the scorching sun as he scanned the serene streets of an affluent neighborhood. His 2-decade career had trained him to pick up subtle cues, but his instincts were not always aligned with fairness. That was the case when he noticed a young black girl walking alone along the sidewalk, wearing a backpack, her eyes scanning the houses as if searching for something familiar. Suspicion flickered in Tim's mind. What's a kid like her doing here? He pulled his patrol car to the side of the road and stepped out. "Hey kid, what are you doing around here?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but there was an unmistakable edge to his voice. Harriet Richards, just 12 years old, froze for a moment, clutching the straps of her backpack tighter. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had heard stories about encounters like this, but she never thought it would happen to her. She took a deep breath, knowing she had to stay calm. "I'm just going to my friend's house," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We live nearby. My dad owns." "Don't try to run a story on me, kid." Tim cut her off, convinced she didn't belong. He stepped closer, towering over her, intimidating. Harriet took a step back, feeling her throat tighten with fear. "You got ID or something?" he asked. Harriet shook her head. "I wasn't told I needed." "Yeah, figures," Tim muttered, frustration building. She tried again, speaking faster this time. "My dad is James Richards. We live just a few blocks from here. Please, I promise." But Tim's mind was already set. A kid with no ID, wandering alone in this kind of neighborhood? He didn't hear the truth in her words, only what his biases told him. He reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder. "I've got a suspicious individual here." Taking her in for questioning. Before Harriet could protest, he grabbed her wrist not harshly, but firmly enough to signal that resistance wouldn't be tolerated. Her eyes stung with tears, but she blinked them away. She knew that if she struggled, things might get worse. At the station, Tim filled out the report without a second thought, listing Harriet as detained for suspicion of trespassing. Harriet sat silently, gripping the arms of the hard metal chair. The police station felt cold and unforgiving, and she felt smaller than ever under the harsh fluorescent lights. She glanced nervously at the clock. Her father would be home by now. He'd know something was wrong. And Harriet knew what would follow her dad's anger, the accusations, and maybe, just maybe, this officer's entire world would be flipped upside down. And she was right. The air inside the police station felt heavier as Tim Walker slumped into a chair, replaying the arrest in his mind. For years, he had followed procedures without question, believing his actions aligned with justice. But today, something gnawed at him. His encounter with Harriet wasn't sitting right. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front doors flying open. James Richards entered, a storm of fury trailing behind him. His sharp eyes swept the room until they landed on Tim, who felt the weight of every step James took toward him. "Are you the officer who arrested my daughter?" James asked, his voice low, but each word carried a controlled anger that felt more dangerous than yelling. Tim stood, feeling defensive. "Mr. Richards, your daughter was found." "In her own neighborhood?" James interrupted, venom in his tone. "How, exactly, does a child walking home warrant handcuffs? Tell me, Officer Walker, what did you see in my daughter that made her a threat?" Tim opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. The truth sat heavy in his chest. He hadn't really seen Harriet at all. James took a step closer, towering over Tim. "You didn't arrest her because she did something wrong. You arrested her because she didn't fit your idea of who belongs in this part of town." His voice cracked, not with weakness, but with the sharp edge of a father's fury. "You humiliated my little girl. You took away her sense of safety." The weight of James' words settled over Tim, making it hard to breathe. He had spent 20 years as a police officer believing he was protecting people, but now, standing face to face with James Richards, he saw the cracks in his sense of justice. He had hurt an innocent child, not with violence, but with assumptions, and that wound might never heal. The station fell silent, all eyes on the unfolding confrontation. Tim tried to find his footing. I was following protocol. Don't give me that, James snapped, cutting him off. You didn't follow protocol. You followed your prejudice. Tim looked away, shame burning in his chest. He wanted to defend himself, but deep down he knew James was right. James straightened his jacket, trying to regain his composure. If it were up to me, you'd lose your badge today, he said coldly. Tim flinched at the words, knowing they might very well become reality. But firing you solves nothing. It doesn't change what you did, and it doesn't make my daughter's experience go away. Tim's heart sank. The idea of losing his job, a career that had become his identity, terrified him. But there was no hiding from the fact that he had messed up in a way that no apology could fix. What happens now? Tim asked quietly, bracing himself for the worst. You're going to make this right, James said, his voice firm. You're going to work at our community center. Volunteer, every week, until you understand what it means to see the people you're supposed to serve. And until you figure that out, you don't belong in this uniform. Tim blinked, taken aback. Volunteering? He had expected termination, not redemption. I don't understand. Why give me a second chance? James paused, then said, because you need to learn. And my daughter deserves to see that people can change. At that moment, Harriet stepped through the door. She had been waiting in the car, but something inside her told her she needed to be part of this. Her eyes met Tim's across the room, and she could see the turmoil in his expression: guilt, shame, regret. Dad. It's okay, she said softly, tugging on her father's arm. James looked down at her, the anger in his eyes softening. No, sweetie. It's not okay, James said, his voice gentle now. But it's going to be. Tim watched Harriet, surprised at the calmness she exuded. She wasn't angry, though she had every right to be. She was sad, but there was also a quiet strength in her gaze that unnerved him. You could have ignored me, she said quietly, her words directed at Tim. You didn't have to listen, but you did, and that means you have to do better now. Her words, so simple and yet so profound, struck Tim harder than James' anger. Harriet was giving him something he didn't deserve: grace. Tim nodded slowly, his throat tight. I'll do better, he whispered. I promise. James gave a curt nod, signaling that their conversation was over. See you at the community center, Officer Walker. As James and Harriet turned to leave, Tim stood frozen, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a cop, he felt like a man at a crossroads, standing on the edge of change. The next morning, Tim sat at his kitchen table, the community center's address scribbled on a notepad in front of him. His badge sat next to it, glinting in the morning light. For 20 years, the badge had defined who he was. But now, it felt like an illusion, a shield he had hidden behind, instead of a symbol of service. Tim knew that volunteering wouldn't be easy. He would be forced to confront parts of himself he had never questioned. He would have to learn how to listen, really listen, to people's stories. And perhaps hardest of all, he would have to accept that growth was a process, not a destination. As he grabbed his keys and headed out the door, he whispered to himself, one day at a time. Because change wasn't about grand gestures or quick fixes. It was about showing up every day, ready to learn no matter how hard it got. And maybe, just maybe, Harriet Richards had given him the gift of a second chance. And this time, Tim Walker intended to make it count. The smell of fresh paint and the sound of children laughing filled the air as Tim Walker stepped into the community center for his first day of volunteering. His police uniform had been swapped for a plain t-shirt and jeans, making him feel stripped of his authority, exposed. He glanced nervously around the room. This was foreign ground for him, no protocols, no badges to hide behind. Just people. At a nearby table, Harriet sat cross-legged with a group of younger children, guiding their hands across sheets of paper with colored pencils. She caught Tim's eye for a moment and gave him a small, knowing smile, not one of triumph but of quiet encouragement. Tim swallowed hard and looked away. The shame still sat heavy in his chest, a constant reminder that he didn't belong here, not yet. A tall woman named Carla, one of the center's coordinators, approached him with a clipboard. "Glad you made it, Officer Walker," she said, her tone polite but distant. "We've got a few tasks to get you started. Today, you'll be working with the kids on an art project." Tim tried to offer a polite smile in return. "Sounds good," he mumbled, though the tightness in his chest suggested otherwise. He walked over to the table where Harriet and the others were drawing. As he sat down, the children went quiet, eyeing him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Tim knew that look. It was the same one he wore whenever he met someone he didn't trust. Tim Walker returned to the community center every week, feeling both the weight of his mistakes and a flickering hope that redemption was within reach. But progress was slow, and nothing about the work came easily. He felt awkward, unsure of his place among the children who still looked at him with wary eyes. And yet, he kept showing up, determined to change, even if it meant stumbling along the way. Each day brought new challenges. Malik, the boy who had questioned Tim's presence, was particularly skeptical. He would test Tim's patience, making sly comments and pushing boundaries, hoping to find the cracks in Tim's resolve. One afternoon, Tim helped organize a soccer game with the kids. As he jogged along the field, calling out instructions, Malik deliberately kicked the ball into Tim's side. "Oops," Malik said with a smirk, daring Tim to react. Tim clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar burn of frustration rise within him. His instincts screamed to call the boy out, to demand respect, but he caught himself. He remembered the way Harriet had looked at him, that first day, a quiet reminder that change wouldn't come through force or anger. Taking a deep breath, Tim crouched down to Malik's level. "Nice kick," he said with a half smile. "Think you can aim for the goal next time?" Malik blinked, caught off guard by Tim's calm response. For the first time, Tim saw something shift in the boy's expression: confusion, maybe even curiosity. The tension between them didn't dissolve entirely, but the moment marked a small step toward mutual understanding. Over the following weeks, Tim started to notice how the children interacted with each other, how they laughed, argued, forgave, and played without the walls of prejudice that had defined so much of his own life. These kids, despite the challenges they faced, moved through the world with a resilience that Tim couldn't help but admire. Then, one day, a breakthrough came, not with words, but with action. It was a rainy afternoon, and the kids were restless, cooped up inside the center. Tim had just finished setting up an arts and crafts table when Malik came barreling through the room, bumping hard into Tim's side. Without thinking, Tim's hand shot out and grabbed Malik by the arm. "Hey, slow down," he barked, louder than intended. The room fell silent. All the progress Tim had made felt like it had just crumbled. Malik froze, his face a mask of defiance. But beneath it, Tim saw a flicker of fear, just like the fear he had seen in Harriet's eyes the day he arrested her. Tim let go of Malik's arm and took a step back. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I shouldn't have grabbed you like that." Malik stared at him, clearly taken aback by the apology. Slowly, the boy gave a small nod. "It's cool," Malik muttered, shuffling his feet. Harriet, who had been watching the whole exchange, approached Tim with a small, knowing smile. "You're getting better," she said quietly. Tim let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "One step at a time," he replied with a wry smile. It wasn't just the children who were starting to notice Tim's efforts. Carla, the program coordinator, began to see the shift as well. One afternoon, she approached Tim with a stack of papers. "We're planning a community event next month," she said. It's going to be a block party, food, games, the whole works. We're hoping it'll help bridge the gap between the residents and the local police." Tim raised an eyebrow. "And you want me to be involved?" Carla smiled. "You've come a long way, Tim. The kids are starting to trust you. Maybe it's time the rest of the community saw what we've seen." The idea of standing in front of the neighborhood, representing both the police and the community center, made Tim's stomach churn. But he knew this was part of the journey, a chance to rebuild the bridges he had once burned. "I'm in," he said, nodding. As the block party approached, Tim threw himself into the preparations. He worked alongside the children, setting up tables, organizing activities, and making sure every detail was perfect. Malik even volunteered to help with the soccer game, a sign that trust was slowly being built. On the day of the event, the community center buzzed with excitement. Families filled the streets, music played from loudspeakers, and the smell of barbecue wafted through the air. Tim watched as police officers mingled with residents, laughing and sharing stories, bridges being built, one conversation at a time. In the middle of the festivities, Tim spotted Harriet sitting at a table with a stack of drawings. She waved him over with a grin. "I made you something," she said, handing him a new picture. Tim unfolded the paper to reveal another bridge, this one completed, with children and adults standing together on both sides, holding hands. "Think we're getting there?" Harriet asked, her eyes shining with hope. Tim looked at the drawing, then back at Harriet. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think we are." That evening, as the block party wound down, Tim stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the people he once saw as strangers now feel like neighbors. He knew his journey was far from over. There would be more mistakes, more moments of doubt and struggle. But for the first time in a long while, Tim felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, not just as a police officer, but as a member of the community. He looked down at the drawing in his hand, tracing the lines of the bridge with his thumb. It was more than just a picture, it was a promise. A reminder that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a better future, one step at a time. And for that, Tim Walker would keep showing up. Weeks passed, and though Tim Walker was learning, the journey was anything but smooth. Each day at the community center brought new tests, making Tim confront not only the children's distrust but also the deep-seated biases within himself. He felt progress, but it was slow, painfully slow. One afternoon, after a long day of games and mentoring, Tim found Harriet sitting alone at a picnic table outside the center, sketching quietly. The sun cast a golden hue over the playground, and for a moment, everything felt still. Tim hesitated, then walked over, sitting on the opposite side of the table. "Hey," he said softly. Harriet glanced up and smiled. "Hey, Officer Walker." Tim shook his head. "Just Tim," he corrected with a small grin. They sat in silence for a while, the soft scratching of Harriet's pencil filling the air. Tim glanced at her drawing a garden filled with flowers, blooming in every color. "You're really good at that," Tim said. Harriet gave a small shrug. "It's just something I do to think." She added a butterfly to the corner of the page. "It helps me make sense of stuff." Tim leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I could use a little of that," he admitted, "trying to make sense of things." Harriet looked at him, her young face wise beyond her years. "You mean with the kids?" Tim nodded. "And with myself," he added quietly. "It's not easy to realize you've been wrong about things for so long." He rubbed the back of his neck, struggling to find the right words. "I hurt you, Harriet. I judged you before I even knew you. And for that, I'm sorry." Harriet set her pencil down and folded her hands in her lap. She looked at Tim with a seriousness that made her seem far older than 12. "I was really scared that day," she said, her voice soft but steady. And it hurt that you didn't believe me, even when I told you the truth." Tim felt a lump rise in his throat. "I know, and I wish I could take it back." "But," Harriet continued, "I also think people can change." She looked him in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "And I think you're trying." Tim blinked, caught off guard by the simple power of her words. "I am," he whispered. "I don't know if I'll ever get it all right, but I'm trying." Harriet gave him a small, encouraging smile. "That's what matters." In that moment, Tim realized that Harriet's forgiveness wasn't just a gift, it was a challenge. It wasn't about pretending the past didn't happen. It was about committing to being better, day by day. Harriet picked up her drawing again and began adding more flowers. Tim watched her in silence, feeling the weight of her words settle into his heart. "You know," Harriet said, without looking up, "change isn't like flipping a switch. It's more like planting a garden." Tim raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "You plant seeds," Harriet explained, shading the petals of a sunflower. "And you water them, take care of them. But you don't see anything right away. It takes time, and sometimes things grow slower than you want them to." Tim smiled, realizing the depth of her metaphor. "But eventually they bloom," he said softly. Harriet nodded. "If you keep at it." Later that evening, as Tim drove home, Harriet's words echoed in his mind. Change isn't a switch, it's a garden. The idea resonated with him deeply. He had spent 20 years following rigid rules and procedures, thinking that was enough to make him a good cop. But now he understood that being good required more than rules, it required heart, patience, and humility. And, just like Harriet had said, it took time. The next morning, Tim arrived at the community center early. He stood in front of a bulletin board where the children's artwork was displayed, scanning the drawings until he found the one Harriet had given him, the bridge with people on both sides, connected at the center. He smiled to himself, then turned to help with the preparations for the day's activities. There were more conversations to have, more moments to navigate carefully, more steps to take. But for the first time, Tim felt ready to embrace the process. He wasn't perfect. He would still make mistakes. But he knew now that it wasn't about avoiding failure, it was about learning from it. And with Harriet's wisdom guiding him, Tim felt hopeful for the future. Harriet's voice echoed in his mind one last time. It's not about being perfect. It's about trying and not giving up. And that was exactly what Tim intended to do. The air was crisp as the last few guests began to leave the community event. The once lively streets now echoed with the soft hum of conversation and the laughter of children reluctant to go home. Tim Walker stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, taking in the scene around him. Families waved goodbye to police officers, who no longer felt like distant enforcers but neighbors. The fences that once divided this community, seen and unseen, seemed to dissolve under the warm glow of streetlights. As the crowd thinned, Harriet ran up to Tim, breathless and smiling. Her curly hair bounced with every step, and in her hand she held 2 colorful paper bracelets. "Here," she said, placing one in Tim's hand. "We made these for everyone who helped today." Tim turned the bracelet over in his hand. It was simple, woven from colored strips of paper, but the words written along the edges made his throat tighten. "We build bridges together." Tim knelt to Harriet's level and smiled. "This is perfect. Thank you, Harriet." The young girl gave a playful grin. "I figured you needed one, since you're the bridge builder in chief." Tim chuckled, feeling a warmth spread through him. It wasn't the forced camaraderie of old, where he tried to be polite out of duty. This was different, real, earned. As Tim rose, he noticed James Richards standing a few feet away, watching them with quiet approval. Tim gave Harriet a gentle nudge. "Your dad's waiting for you, kiddo." Harriet glanced back, then stood on her tiptoes and gave Tim a quick hug, unexpected but genuine. "You did good, Tim," she whispered before skipping off toward her father. Tim stood there for a moment, stunned by the simple, powerful gesture. In that embrace, he felt something shift, as if years of weight he didn't know he carried had been lifted. James approached, his expression softer than Tim had ever seen. "She really likes you, you know." Tim smiled. "I like her too. She's taught me more than I thought possible." James gave a thoughtful nod, folding his arms. "You know, when this all started, I wanted nothing more than to see you lose your badge. I was angry, furious, even." "I don't blame you," Tim said quietly. "But somewhere along the way," James continued, "I realized that firing you wouldn't have fixed anything. It wouldn't have changed what Harriet went through. It wouldn't have made the world better." James placed a hand on Tim's shoulder. "What you've done, what you've become, is worth far more than punishment. You've proven that people can change. And that's something this community desperately needed to see." Tim swallowed hard, overcome with emotion. "I only did what I had to, what was right." James smiled, his grip firm on Tim's shoulder. "And that, Tim, is exactly why you belong here." As the night grew darker, Tim found himself lingering at the now empty community center. He walked the familiar halls, remembering how awkward and out of place he had felt on his first day here. Now, those same walls felt like home. He passed by the bulletin board where the children's artwork was displayed. There, among the vibrant pictures, was Harriet's latest drawing, the completed bridge with people standing hand in hand. Tim gently touched the edge of the paper, as if the bridge itself were something sacred, a reminder that second chances were not just given, but built. For the first time in years, Tim felt peace, not the fleeting peace of avoiding conflict, but the deeper kind that comes from making things right. He had been through the fire, stripped of his illusions and biases, and what remained was something better, stronger, kinder. The next morning, Tim woke early, slipping into his uniform with a newfound sense of purpose. His badge, once a symbol of power, now felt like a promise, a commitment, not just to enforce the law, but to serve with empathy and compassion. Before heading to his patrol, Tim made one last stop, the community center. He pinned the colorful paper bracelet Harriet had given him onto the sun visor of his patrol car, a reminder that every day was another opportunity to build trust, to be better. As he stood outside the center, watching the sun rise over the quiet streets, Malik's voice called out behind him. "Hey, Officer Walker." Tim turned to see Malik jogging toward him, a grin on his face. "You coming to soccer practice later, or what?" Tim laughed, shaking his head. "You know I'm always up for a game."
Malik gave him a playful shove before running off. Tim watched him go, feeling that same warmth settle in his chest. The kids trusted him now, not because he wore a badge, but because he had earned it.
Over the following months, Tim's transformation continued, both within the community and the police force. He became an advocate for change, leading initiatives that encouraged officers to engage with the neighborhoods they patrolled. He helped organize workshops on unconscious bias, sharing his own journey openly, hoping others might learn from his mistakes. His relationship with James and Harriet grew deeper, becoming something more than just an obligation. They shared meals, attended events together, and slowly, Tim became more than just the officer who had once made a terrible mistake. He became family. One evening, after another community gathering, Harriet gave Tim one final gift, a small canvas painting of the bridge she had drawn so many times. This one was more detailed, with vibrant colors and intricate designs. At the center of the bridge, she had painted Tim, Harriet, and James, standing side by side, hands clasped together. Beneath it, she had written, "Bridges aren't built alone." Tim's throat tightened as he took in the painting. He looked at Harriet, who gave him a mischievous grin. "Told you, it wasn't about being perfect." Tim chuckled, pulling her into a gentle hug. "You're right. It never was." Years later, when people spoke of Tim Walker, they didn't just talk about his 2 decades of service as a police officer. They talked about the man who changed not because he had to, but because he chose to. Tim's story became a beacon of hope for others, proof that redemption was always possible if you were willing to face your mistakes, learn from them, and do the hard work of building bridges. And through it all, Harriet's words stayed with him. It's not about being perfect. It's about trying and not giving up. As Tim stood on the bridge of his life, one he had built, brick by brick, with every act of kindness, every apology, and every second chance, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not just as a police officer, but as a friend, a neighbor, and a man who had learned the true meaning of justice. And with each sunrise, Tim woke up with the same promise in his heart to keep building, keep trying, and never, ever give up. Because the bridges we build today become the paths toward a better tomorrow.